Hey guys, John here. Welcome back to Reddit Aliens. What is something you learned about a loved one only after they passed away? So please remember to like, share, and subscribe. My maternal grandmother was a con artist and lived life on the run since she was 21 years old. I've since uncovered 7 different marriage certificates around different states, marrying different men, and I suppose funding her lifestyle. I also believe she abducted my mother from a hospital, as we found her real birth mother now, aged 91. It's an insane story I've uncovered. My grandpa was a preacher in a little town in South Carolina in like the early 50s. He preached at the white church most of the month and would go preach at the black church once a month to give their preacher a break. He struck up a friendship with one of the guys at that church and eventually wore the guy down enough that he came to the white church for a visit. See, Grandpa had never experienced these people as being anything less than totally welcoming, and he thought they all believed as he did, that everyone is a child of God and welcome in the church, no matter who they were. So, the poor guy comes in and is made to sit in the very last row and is totally ignored. They wouldn't even bring communion to him. Grandpa got down from his pulpit, ripped the communion stuff out of someone's hands, and took it to his friend himself. Then he got back up at the outfit and yelled at everyone about how God loves everyone equally and doesn't differentiate based on color, and made quite a stink. There was a cross burning on his lawn that night. He had little kids and a wife to take care of, so he couldn't fight the way he wanted to. 2 weeks later, he moved back to his hometown in Texas, where they accepted Grandpa and his beliefs in people's equality much more readily. Why I wasn't told about this before Grandpa died, I'll never know. He was a class act from beginning to end, what every Christian is supposed to be, and so few manage. That my grandmother lied about all her recipes. I used to ask for copies of recipes of my favorites, but I could never make it taste right. I'd cook things with her, and when I did it with her, helping never tasted right. Always got the, oh don't worry, it takes practice. Thought I was just a terrible cook for years. When clearing out her home after she passed away recently, my dad found a secret stash of recipes, very well hidden. Turns out all the copies she wrote for us were wrong, deliberately. I'm 43 and just started making these recipes again off her secret stash recipes, and wouldn't you know, I could make them taste the way they should. My great-aunt Bernice was always lovingly referred to by family as Bernice the whore, because she had a bunch of babies and told the family that she left them with various family members across the country immediately after birth. I did some Ancestry.com research and discovered that aside from the 3 living children everyone knew, she'd lost 6 babies, 3 stillbirths that were a year apart respectively, then stillborn twins, then a baby girl who lived 2 days. Poor Bernice. She somehow felt that there would be less stigma attached to the idea that she was leaving her children over and over than the reality of her losses. It's hard for me to see the name Bernice and not want to quote Dodgeball and say, God damn it, Bernice. And then the story had a bummer ending, so now I'm just stuck with it, but that's my comment. My maternal grandmother we found after she had passed was using 10% of her income to sponsor unfortunate kids all over the world. She had been doing it for the last 40 years of her life non-stop. We found letters of her giving those kids advice and then keeping in contact with them pretty much their whole lives. She received pictures of them growing up and having families. Essentially, my grandmother had far more than 5 kids. She helped to raise and more grandchildren and essentially great-grandchildren than we ever knew. Most of the kids she sponsored were orphans. We spent the next several months after her death getting in touch with all these people. Some managed to attend her funeral. Some to this day made a trip to where we spread her ashes and sent us photos of them there. We knew she was a saint to us, but we didn't know she was a saint to hundreds of children, spanning 4 decades. My grandfather was a bank executive at a small bank in a farm town in Arkansas. After his death, my mother found a ledger in his safety deposit box. He made loans to people the bank had denied due to background, type of employment, and/or skin color. He made the loans from his own pocket. Most of the loans were between $200 and $500. He charged a nominal percentage rate, and everything he earned in interest he donated to the church. My grandmother had no idea and was heartwarmed when she found out. He died in 1972. My grandfather died almost 2 years ago. He suffered from Parkinson's for 15 years, and that led to other health issues. In his last few years, his cognitive abilities were very compromised. In a brief moment of clarity, though, he wrote a long note for my grandma. It was a collection of memories from the time they got married, purchased a ranch, had children, and other life moments. It was very sweet and so precious. He didn't give it to my grandma, so she discovered it many months after his passing. After my dad killed himself, I learned he did not in fact have brain cancer. It was a lie meant to ease his passing for himself and theoretically for those he left behind. My grandmother was a Mafia mistress, and my dad was the product of an affair with a married man and not the man who raised him. Also found out that the string of really bad luck she had in the 60s was actually that man trying to get rid of her because she went full Glenn Close and Fatal Attraction crazy on him when he tried to break off the affair. We met our long-lost family after I took a DNA test, and we are afraid of them. My grandfather had a VHS collection of pornography. He passed away around 6 years ago, and it was all blonde women. Funniest thing to find though, when you're mourning, I can tell you that for sure. Sentimental things everywhere, pictures on his desk, the thumbprint tie I made for him as a child, and a massive box of pornography. My grandpa was a good, straight-laced, hard-working man. He liked gardening and cooking meals from his native Poland. The only punk thing about him was this badass old tattoo in his arm, which we never asked about. At his funeral, my uncle explained that he'd paid 12 cigarettes for that tattoo in a refugee camp. Turns out, my gentle grandpa had been separated from his family by the Nazis in the invasion and sent to a forced labor farm. After the farm was liberated, he wound up in this refugee camp with other ex-slaves. We believe he bought the tattoo there to cover up some kind of slave number the Nazis gave him, kind of a way to bury the past behind him before building a new life from scratch in Australia. My grandma couldn't read. She was dyslexic and labeled stupid. Teachers said it was a waste of time to teach her. She was smart, kind, and strong. They should have taught her. She loved to listen to books on tape. I never knew that was the only way she could read. Oh, okay, I got this one. My mom's late boyfriend, really great guy, colon cancer and passed at age 54. He was a lifelong firefighter after the army. He joked all the time about being a spy in Vietnam. Always joked about having a third-degree black belt, just on and on. You never knew if you could take him seriously. So he passed. Sad times, of course. I helped Mom clean out his house. We find his old war chest from the Spanish-American War was passed down. Opened it up and goddamn, I start finding all sorts of papers marked top secret. All sorts of coded messages. I could make out bits of things, but it was in verbiage I didn't understand. And, hey look, there's a black belt that is rather old. He wasn't lying the whole time. My grandmother passed a couple of years ago. She was in her 90s, a wonderful, bright, classy lady whom I loved. She worked in Strike Command in the war, the girls moving the model planes on the big maps in World War II films, then worked at Bletchley Park toward the end of the war. It's known for being a major center for Allied codebreaking. And then, when the war ended, she went to work on the Coal Board, government organization that managed the procurement and distribution of a critical resource at the time, when she met my grandfather. I started reading John le Carre's novels a few years ago after seeing one next to my grandfather's chair when visiting. In one book, I forgot which, the Coal Board is used as a euphemism for a secret service. I formed a theory that my grandmother worked in British intelligence in the years after the war, and so did my grandfather. Earlier this year, I visited my granddad, now in his mid-90s, still heartbroken after losing his great love, but doing much better now. We were chatting about my grandmother over a cuppa, and I told him my theory. He looked me dead in my eyes and said, "Well, it's about time someone worked it out." When I mentioned the theory to my dad some weeks later, he suddenly seemed to be flustered and changed the subject very quickly. Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy, and The Spy Who Came In for the Cold are two books I really enjoy that would be considered historical fiction. Do you guys read any of that stuff? My dad passed when I was 6 years old. He loved golf. My single mom couldn't afford to put me in it, but I used to dabble at the local park. Finally, in college, I could afford the uni rate of $200 all summer, 92. One night I went out and joined two older guys. They saw my last name on my tag and asked if I was Joe's kid. I was. I spent those 9 holes learning about him crashing his Aston Martin, hitchhiking across Canada with just his wallet that I am using right now, and how much he could drink. But they didn't leave out the fact that his crazy partying days ended when he met Mom. That happened 30 years this summer. Heck, maybe to the week, but I'm still tearing up finishing this post. My dad died in 1988. He was a smart man, a qualified engineer who worked for Lucas, Lotus, and Fafnir during his career. During my childhood in the 70s, I, like most little boys of that era, was fascinated by space, rockets, and astronauts, and Dad always encouraged my interest. He'd buy me books and toys that were space-related, and would talk about spacey things with me for hours on end. With his help, I turned into such a space nerd that in my first year of secondary school, US 6th grade, when we each had to give 5-minute talks during English about a topic we were passionate about, I talked for over 30 minutes about the stellar life cycle. I found out only a few years ago from Mum that he believed that the moon landing was a hoax. My brain literally stalled. I was speechless and couldn't process it. Grandma and Grandpa let my dad and a couple other aunts or uncles get molested by a priest, did nothing about it. Years later, the priest gets run out of town and moves to the Philippines. He must have effed around over there too, because we found out later on he got beaten to death and mutilated by a mob of angry parents or something. Justice was served, but not by my grandparents. My granddad was a medic in World War II. It was an unspoken rule that you never asked him about his time in the service. I didn't find out why until long after he passed away. Toward the end of the war, he and his unit came across a burnt-out barn. Inside were the bodies of POWs that had been locked inside, and then the barn was set on fire. It's also possible he helped to liberate concentration camps, but we don't know for sure because he never talked about it. We only know the barn story because one night he got drunk and let it slip to my mother. One of my grandfathers died some years back. My last surviving grandparent, my mom's father, he was a pretty hard dude. He was a partisan fighter in World War II despite being barely past his teens for much of the war. Immigrated to the US, married my grandma, got his teaching degree despite having had to learn English on the fly. Really inspiring. But when he died, my mom and I were the ones who went through all the belongings. We found children's books in Polish. My grandfather was born in Poland, dated to the 1920s. Either he brought them over, or he had them sent over. It's just really telling to me that my hard-ass grandpa wanted to keep books he presumably had as a child. I own them now. They're like treasures to me. At a family gathering, friends of my grandfather who passed years ago kept telling stories and calling him Black Dot. Apparently, my grandfather would mark his golf balls with a black dot, so he knew which one was his. They'd end up in the rough a lot, and he'd always enlist whoever he was golfing with to help him find the ball with the black dot. Nothing scandalous or devious, just a lighthearted anecdote that makes me smile. My dad thought I wasn't his kid due to my mom cheating on him with some rando from a bar just before she found out she was pregnant with me. Long story, I'll try to shorten. My dad was trusting, wanted to give her a break, and told her to go out. She got shit-faced, went home with said rando, woke up next to him, confessed what happened to my dad, who not only forgave her, but helped her get rid of the crabs the bar guy gave her. Anyway, she said that might have been the reason he and I weren't close. I was 17 when she told me this, and my father had passed away 3 months before. Years later, I've given him a lot of thought to this and realized that might have been why my grandpa didn't like me and favored my older sister and younger brother. When my dad was actively dying, he came to see him, asked my brother if he knew who he was, and of course my brother said, "You're my grandpa." He looked at me, gave me a dirty-ass look, and walked by me. I'm my father's kid. I look quite a bit like him, I think. At the time, I want to do a 23andMe test, but I'm terrified about the what if. The word father or dad is defined by actions and not just one night. So, if the person who raised you is your father, he's your father. In high school, my uncle lived with me and my dad. My uncle was a great guy, worked hard, cared about his son that he had just one custody of, Helped me a lot in that time that he lived with us and was just an all-around good person. My junior year of high school, he died in his sleep. His girlfriend woke up to his dead body in their bed. I was just a few rooms down the hall and heard her screaming for my dad. I had no idea what was going on, but my dad was just an absolute wreck, screaming and crying. The only other time I had ever seen him cry was when my mom died. My family told me that my uncle died from sleep apnea. 2 years later, my grandmother and I were talking about my uncle, how I missed him, and that it would be like if he was still around for his son, and so on. She let it slip that he actually OD'd on heroin. You would have never guessed he was an addict. He looked like he was entirely put together with a great job, multiple cars, a boat, and all-around good life. This isn't the end of it though. A few months ago, I was talking to my dad about just life in general and some of the things that happened in my childhood that hurt me. Life wasn't pretty for a while. My dad was an addict my whole life, but is 4 years clean. My dad told me that he was the one who gave my uncle the heroin that killed him. I couldn't believe it when he told me. The amount of guilt he has on his shoulders because of it is so immense that I don't know how he has managed to live with it. Can you imagine being the one to inadvertently cause the death of someone you love? I can't imagine it. I love my father more than anyone. I feel for him because of it, but he is the one who gave it to him. I don't think anything could be worse than that. We are reasonably sure that my uncle killed his father. Grandpa L, a part-time Southern Baptist preacher, was like many men of his generation. He went to work, came home expecting dinner on the table no later than 10 minutes after he walked in the door, and would sit in his favorite chair in the parlor after dinner to read the paper and drink. He was a mean, abusive drunk, and it grew worse after Grandma S was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, making her an unfit wife. That's when and why we suspect that Grandpa L began assaulting his daughters, including my then 7-year-old mother and my then 17-year-old Aunt C. I don't know how long the assaults went on, only that 1 week after Uncle J graduated college, Grandpa L accidentally discharged his rifle while cleaning it for hunting season. The only problem with that story is that Grandpa L never participated in hunting season. Said hunting was for savages, in fact, but Uncle J was well known for being an avid and enthusiastic hunter. My mother died the day I found out I was pregnant with twins back in January. I found out she kept a pregnancy book she used for her pregnancy with me and was planning to give it to me when I became pregnant. Breaks my heart to know I didn't get to tell her and see her excitement. Oh. We found out that my grandma was pregnant with my dad before she and my grandpa got married. They lied about their wedding date. My dad was born in February 1957, and they actually got married in the fall of '56, but said they got married in the spring of '56. My mom said they had a big 30th anniversary party on the fake date. We didn't find out until after my grandma passed away about 5 years ago, and my grandpa had been gone for 25 years. My great-grandmother's sister died because of a botched abortion in the 1920s. She was 19 years old. We knew that she died young, but we didn't know why until after my great-grandma passed away in the early 2000s. My grandfather was part of Hitler Youth when he was very young. He didn't talk about this past much and was quite the asshole until the stroke later in life. After he passed, I took some of the old family photos that lined the walls going down the stairs at his house. They were all from people long gone and in no way sentimental to me. I really just wanted the frames. I took them home, shoved them in a drawer for future craft projects. Eventually, like a year later, I pull out one and take the back off for the glass and the old photo out. That's when I see it. Behind the picture and staring at me was a glossy large photo of Hitler's face. It had been hidden and hanging on the wall for years. I found out after my mom's dad passed away that he might not be my grandpa after all. Turns out my grandma liked to sleep with a lot of men. My grandma slept with my grandpa's dad, my great-grandpa. 9 months later, my mother was born. My mom was convinced that who she called her dad was really her brother. It took a DNA test to prove that my grandpa was indeed my actual grandpa. My grandmother on my mother's side also married into the Chicago mob. I heard some stories growing up. It wasn't until she passed away when I found out the hidden room in the attic. It had a bed and everything you would need to survive to hide away for a while. This is more about me than my grandmother, but it is a secret she kept from me until the day she died. I'm a product of an affair my mom had after she and her then husband were at the edge of a divorce. I'm not going to make the long story, but after I was born, my actual dad wanted to be part of my life with the only condition that he needed to be able to say he was my father. But my mom had to tell him no, because my grandmother told her not to do it because it was the most expected child in my enormous family, and she didn't want anyone to know I was the product of an infidelity because she was afraid that her friends and other members of her family would look down on her and my mother. My mother told me all of this 3 years after my grandmother died out of regret for never telling me. I still love her and miss her, but I'm angry that the whole reason I grew up without a father was because she was afraid of other people's opinions.